In the spring of 1842, when Mobile, Alabama was still enjoying its golden era as one of the busiest ports in the United States, a series of events began to unfold at the Price estate that would eventually lead to what local newspapers would later call the darkest chapter in Baldwin County's history. The Price family was well established in the community, their plantation situated approximately 15 miles north of Mobile Bay, in an area where the whispers of the wind, through the tall pines, seemed to carry secrets that no one dared to speak aloud. Nathaniel Price was known throughout the region as a successful merchant who had made his fortune in the cotton trade. His estate, which he called Willowbrook, stood as a testament to his prosperity. A grand, white-columned manor house surrounded by acres of cultivated land that stretched toward the horizon. Yet there was something about the Price estate that made visitors uneasy, though few could articulate precisely what it was. Perhaps it was the way the house seemed to watch from its perch atop a gentle rise, windows like vacant eyes staring out over the fields. Or perhaps it was the way Nathaniel Price himself moved through the community, respected certainly, but never truly known. According to county records that survived until 1963, when they were transferred to the Alabama Department of Archives and History and subsequently misplaced during a renovation, Nathaniel Price had arrived in Mobile in 1829. He was 32 years old, already possessed of significant wealth, and accompanied by a young wife named Eleanor. Within 3 years, he had established himself as a formidable businessman and built Willowbrook, which quickly became known for its beauty and the silence that seemed to envelop it like a shroud. What is particularly noteworthy about the case, and what has drawn the attention of historical researchers for decades, is the peculiar notation found in the margin of the St. Paul's Episcopal Church registry. Next to the entry recording Eleanor Price's death in childbirth in 1833, an unknown hand had written, "She knew. God forgive us. She knew." The notation was discovered in 1951 by Dr. James Whitaker of the University of Alabama, who was researching mortality rates among plantation-class women in pre-Civil War Alabama. His findings were documented in an obscure academic journal, but were never widely circulated. The church registry itself was badly damaged in a fire in 1968, leaving only Dr. Whitaker's notes as evidence of this curious addition. Following Eleanor's death, Nathaniel Price withdrew from society almost completely for a period of 2 years. When he emerged, he did so with a new wife, Josephine Crawford, the daughter of a prominent family from Montgomery. According to correspondence between Josephine's mother and her sister in Virginia, which was preserved in the Crawford family papers and later donated to the Alabama Historical Society in 1954, the marriage had been arranged quickly and with little consultation with Josephine herself. "I fear for my daughter," wrote Martha Crawford in a letter dated December 12, 1835. "There is something in Mr. Price's manner that suggests a man holding himself together by force of will alone. His first wife's passing seems to have marked him in ways that are difficult to describe. Josephine says little, but I can see in her eyes that all is not well at Willowbrook. If only her father had not been so eager to secure the connection." The years that followed saw the Price family grow. Josephine gave birth to 3 children in quick succession: Thomas in 1836, Mary in 1838, and William in 1840. From all outward appearances, the Price family was thriving. Nathaniel's business continued to expand, and Willowbrook became known for its lavish, though infrequent, social gatherings. Yet there were whispers among the household staff, whispers that eventually found their way into the town of Mobile and beyond. Sarah Johnson, who served as a housemaid at Willowbrook from 1837 to 1841, gave a statement to the Mobile County Sheriff in April of 1863, more than 20 years after the events in question. The statement, which was found in 1957 in a collection of documents related to post-Civil War property disputes, provides one of the few first-hand accounts of life inside the Price home. The master, he was a quiet man. Too quiet sometimes, Johnson stated. He would sit in his study for hours just staring at the wall. The mistress, she was afraid of him, I think. Not that he ever raised a hand to her, not that I saw. But there was something in the way she watched him, like she was waiting for something terrible to happen. And the children, they learned early to be quiet around their father. The house was always so silent, like everyone was holding their breath. What Sarah Johnson could not have known at the time was that Nathaniel Price was indeed harboring a secret, one that would eventually consume not only him, but everyone around him. According to a journal that was discovered hidden in the wall of the study during renovations to the property in 1965, Nathaniel had been involved in activities that, if discovered, would have destroyed him and his family. The journal, which contained entries spanning from 1829 to 1841, was briefly examined by the property's owner at the time, Harold Wexler, before being turned over to a local historical society. Tragically, the journal was lost in a flood that damaged the society's storage facility in 1968, but Wexler's recollections, recorded in an interview conducted by the Mobile Register in 1972, provide some insight into its contents. It was clear from what I read that Price was involved in something illegal, Wexler recalled. There were references to shipments and payments, but all in a kind of code. What struck me most was the change in his handwriting over the years. In the early entries it was bold and confident. By the end it had become shaky, almost frantic. The last entry I remember was something like, "The silence is no longer a shield, but a prison of my own making." It gave me chills to read it. What exactly Nathaniel Price was involved in has been the subject of much speculation. Some historians have suggested that he may have been engaged in illegal importation of goods to avoid tariffs, while others have proposed more sinister activities. A thesis prepared by graduate student Elizabeth Holbrook at Tulane University in 1959 suggested that Price may have been involved in the illegal slave trade, which had been outlawed in 1808. But continued clandestinely for decades afterward. Holbrook's research was never published and was reportedly discouraged by her academic advisors due to the sensitivity of the subject and the lack of conclusive evidence. Her thesis was archived and largely forgotten until 1968, when it was cited in a footnote in another academic work before disappearing from the university's records during a cataloging transition. Whatever the nature of Nathaniel Price's secret activities, they appear to have intensified in early 1842. According to shipping records from the port of Mobile, preserved in the city's Maritime Museum, vessels connected to Price's trading company made unusually frequent journeys to and from New Orleans during this period, often returning with minimal cargo or documentation. At the same time, entries in the ledgers of Price's company, which survived in fragmentary form in the papers of his business partner, showed large sums of money moving through accounts with little explanation. It was against this backdrop that the events of May 1842 began to unfold. The trigger, it seems, was the arrival of a man named Edward Blackwood. According to passenger manifests from the steamship Carolina, Blackwood arrived in Mobile from Charleston on May 7, 1842. His purpose in Mobile was not recorded, but within days of his arrival, he had made contact with Nathaniel Price. The nature of their connection is suggested by a letter discovered in 1961 among the personal effects of Judge William Harding, who presided over the Mobile Circuit Court from 1840 to 1855. The letter, which was unsigned but dated May 10, 1842, read, "N. The man from Charleston knows everything. He claims to have proof. We must meet immediately to determine our course of action. Burn this. J., Who Jay was remains unknown, though some researchers have speculated that it might have been James Thornton, another prominent mobile businessman who was known to have had dealings with Price. The letter was apparently never delivered, as it remained sealed when it was discovered. Judge Harding's connection to the case is unclear, though court records show that he recused himself from several cases involving Price's business interests in the years following 1842, citing prior knowledge of the parties involved. What happened next is documented in various sources, though the complete picture remains elusive. According to an account published in the Mobile Daily Register on June 2, 1842, Edward Blackwood took lodgings at the Harbour Inn, a respectable establishment near the waterfront. On May 12th, he was seen entering the offices of Nathaniel Price's company. According to the clerk who was interviewed for the article, the meeting between Price and Blackwood was brief but intense, with raised voices heard from behind the closed door of Price's private office. Blackwood departed visibly agitated, and Price did not emerge for several hours. The following day, May 13th, Blackwood was observed at the Mobile Courthouse, where he requested access to shipping records and business registrations. The clerk on duty, Thomas Wilson, later stated that Blackwood had been particularly interested in documentation related to vessels owned by Nathaniel Price and his associates. Wilson's statement, preserved in the court records examined by historians in the 1950s, notes that Blackwood had mentioned something about bringing a great wrong to light before departing with several pages of notes. On May 15th, 1842, Edward Blackwood disappeared. He was last seen leaving the Harbour Inn early in the morning, telling the proprietor that he had business to attend to and would return by evening. When he failed to return for 2 days, the proprietor notified the authorities, and a search was initiated. Blackwood's belongings remained in his room, including a leather portfolio that, according to the initial police report, contained various documents and correspondence of a business nature. The portfolio was taken into police custody, but was subsequently reported missing from the evidence room in July of the same year. No trace of it has ever been found. The disappearance of Edward Blackwood might have remained just another unsolved mystery in a busy port city, were it not for what happened at Willowbrook in the days that followed. According to Sarah Johnson's statement, Nathaniel Price returned to the estate on the evening of May 15th in a state of extreme agitation. He came home late, when everyone was already abed, she recalled. I heard him come in because I was up with young William, who had a fever. The master went straight to his study and locked the door. I could hear him moving around in there all night, and once I thought I heard him weeping. The next morning, Price gathered his family in the dining room and announced that they would be leaving for an extended stay at their summer home on the eastern shore of Mobile Bay, near what is now the town of Fairhope. According to Johnson, this announcement came as a surprise, as the family did not typically relocate to the summer home until June or July, when the heat in the city became oppressive. Moreover, Price insisted that they depart immediately, with only the most essential belongings. The mistress, she tried to ask why the rush, Johnson stated, and he just looked at her with such coldness and said, "Do not question me in this, Josephine. There are matters you cannot understand." The children were frightened by his tone, I think. They didn't cry or make a sound, just went to pack their things like little soldiers. The Price family departed Willowbrook on May 17th, leaving most of the household staff behind, with instructions to maintain the property in their absence. Nathaniel told the staff that they would return in approximately 1 month, but according to Johnson and other accounts, his manner was distracted, almost haunted. He kept looking back at the house as they rode away, Johnson recalled, like he was seeing it for the last time. The summer home, a more modest property known as Bay Haven, was located approximately 20 miles from Willowbrook as the crow flies, but the journey around the northern edge of the bay was considerably longer. According to the recollections of James Foster, who served as Price's coachman and was one of the few staff members to accompany the family, the journey was tense and largely silent. Foster's account, which was recorded in 1878 as part of a local historical society's effort to document the early settlement of the Eastern Shore, describes Nathaniel Price repeatedly checking behind them as if fearful of pursuit. "Mr. Price, he wouldn't let us stop," Foster recalled, "not even when the children needed to rest or when one of the wheels started to come loose. He just kept saying, 'We must reach Bay Haven before nightfall.' I remember thinking it strange, since the summer home wasn't prepared for them. There'd been no message sent ahead." The family arrived at Bay Haven as the sun was setting on May 17th. The property, which had been closed up since the previous summer, was in need of attention. According to Foster, the first night was spent in considerable discomfort, with the family huddled in the main room while Price spent hours writing at a small desk by candlelight. "He wrote letter after letter," Foster stated, "and burned each one after reading it over. I know because I could smell the burning paper, and in the morning there was ash in the fireplace, even though the night had been warm." For the next several days, the Price family remained at Bay Haven, largely isolated from the outside world. Foster was sent to the nearest settlement, which would later become the town of Daphne, to purchase supplies, but was given strict instructions not to engage in conversation about the family's presence or to deliver any messages. According to his account, this isolation was beginning to wear on Josephine Price, who he overheard arguing with her husband on May 20th. "She was saying something about how they couldn't hide forever," Foster recalled. "And Mr. Price, he just kept repeating, 'Silence is our only protection now.' I didn't understand what he meant by that, but the fear in his voice, I'd never heard anything like it from him before." Meanwhile, back in Mobile, the investigation into Edward Blackwood's disappearance was progressing slowly. According to an article published in the Mobile Daily Register on May 25th, authorities had questioned several people who had been seen speaking with Blackwood during his brief stay in the city, including 2 clerks from Nathaniel Price's company. The article noted that Price himself was currently away from the city on family business and had not yet been interviewed. The tone of the article suggested that Blackwood's disappearance was being treated as a routine matter rather than anything sinister, with the most likely explanation being that he had simply left the city without informing his landlord. This changed dramatically on May 28th, when a local fisherman named Robert Turner discovered a man's body washed up on a small, uninhabited island in Mobile Bay, approximately halfway between the city and the Eastern Shore. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, making identification difficult, but items found in the clothing, particularly a distinctive gold watch with the initials EB engraved on the back, strongly suggested that it was Edward Blackwood. The coroner's report, dated May 30th, indicated that the cause of death was drowning, but noted that there were unusual abrasions on the wrists and ankles consistent with restraint, and evidence of a severe blow to the back of the head prior to immersion in water. News of the discovery spread quickly through Mobile, and the authorities now had a potential murder investigation on their hands. On June 1st, a contingent of law enforcement officials led by Sheriff Thomas Reynolds set out for Bay Haven to question Nathaniel Price. What they found when they arrived has been pieced together from various accounts, including the official report filed by Reynolds and later statements from members of the Price household staff who had remained at Willowbrook. Bay Haven was deserted. According to Reynolds' report, preserved in county archives until 1966, when it was transferred to the state repository, there were signs of a hasty departure. Food had been left on the table, clothing lay scattered about, and the door to the house had been left ajar. There was no sign of violence or struggle, but the sense of sudden abandonment was palpable. A thorough search of the surrounding area yielded no trace of the Price family or their coachman. When word reached Willowbrook that the family had disappeared from Bay Haven, the household staff expressed varying degrees of surprise and concern. Sarah Johnson, in her later statement, recalled that the news had been met with an odd mixture of fear and relief among some of the longer-serving staff members. There were those who whispered that it was finally happening, whatever it was, she stated. Like they'd been waiting for something to break for years. The authorities conducted a thorough search of Willowbrook, focusing particularly on Nathaniel Price's study. According to Sheriff Reynolds' report, they discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards that contained a substantial amount of cash, approximately $5,000, a considerable sum in 1842, as well as several documents in code and a small leather-bound book that appeared to be a private ledger. These items were taken into evidence but, like Blackwood's portfolio, were later reported missing from the sheriff's office. Reynolds noted in his report that the documents appeared to relate to business transactions of an unusual nature, though he did not speculate on their legality. As the investigation continued, attention turned to the possible whereabouts of the Price family. Initial theories suggested that they might have fled by sea, perhaps to Cuba or Mexico. The Port Authority was instructed to review all departures since May 28th, but no record was found of any vessel carrying passengers matching the description of the Price family. The search was expanded to include land routes, with inquiries sent to law enforcement in neighboring counties and states, but these too yielded no results. It was at this point that James Thornton, Nathaniel Price's business partner and the suspected author of the unsigned letter found among Judge Harding's effects, came forward with information. According to an interview conducted by Sheriff Reynolds on June 10, 1842, Thornton claimed that Price had confided in him several weeks earlier about a situation that might necessitate a swift departure from Mobile. Thornton stated that Price had mentioned a property in the Florida Territory, near what is now Pensacola, that had been purchased through intermediaries and was unknown to most of his associates. Armed with this information, Sheriff Reynolds and a small group of deputies set out for the location described by Thornton. The property, a modest farmhouse approximately 40 miles east of Pensacola, was reached after 2 days of difficult travel. According to Reynolds' report, dated June 14th, they found the house occupied by an elderly couple who claimed to have purchased it from a land agent just 1 month earlier. They had no knowledge of Nathaniel Price or his family, and a search of the property and surrounding area revealed no evidence of their presence. When Reynolds returned to Mobile, he found that the investigation had taken yet another turn. Josephine Price's brother, William Crawford, had arrived from Montgomery and was demanding action. According to newspaper accounts, Crawford was convinced that his sister and her children had met with foul play, possibly at the hands of Nathaniel Price himself. He pointed to the strange circumstances of their disappearance from Bay Haven and suggested that the discovery of Blackwood's body was not coincidental. "My sister wrote to me in April expressing concern about her husband's behavior," Crawford was quoted as saying in the Mobile Daily Register on June 18th. "She described him as increasingly paranoid, convinced that some unnamed enemy was closing in on him. I fear that this paranoia may have driven him to desperate acts." Crawford's intervention prompted a more thorough investigation of both Willowbrook and Bay Haven. According to records preserved in the Baldwin County Historical Society, a second search of Bay Haven on June 20th yielded a disturbing discovery. In a small outbuilding used to store gardening tools, investigators found a hidden cellar accessible only by removing several floorboards. The cellar, which was approximately 6 feet by 8 feet and barely high enough for a man to stand upright, contained bedding, food supplies, and a small oil lamp. Most significantly, they also found a child's doll that was identified by household staff as belonging to Mary Price, the middle child. This discovery led to speculation that Nathaniel Price might have hidden his family in the cellar before fleeing himself, possibly to throw off pursuers. A more sinister interpretation, suggested by William Crawford, was that Price had imprisoned his family in the cellar before disposing of them, just as he had presumably done with Edward Blackwood. The authorities expanded their search to include the waters of Mobile Bay around Bay Haven, but no bodies were found. As the summer of 1842 progressed, the investigation began to lose momentum. Sheriff Reynolds, in a report dated July 15th, noted that all available leads had been exhausted and that the case would remain open but inactive pending new information. William Crawford returned to Montgomery but continued to press for action through correspondence with various officials, including the governor of Alabama. His efforts yielded little result, and the disappearance of the Price family gradually faded from public attention. It might have remained an unsolved mystery, one of many in the turbulent pre-Civil War South, were it not for a series of discoveries made nearly a decade later. In the spring of 1852, a severe storm caused significant damage to Willowbrook, which had remained unoccupied since the disappearance. The property had passed into the hands of Nathaniel Price's creditors and had been sold several times, but no one had lived there for any length of time. Local rumor suggested that the house was unlucky, perhaps even haunted, though such superstitions were officially discouraged by the community's religious leaders. The storm damage necessitated repairs to the roof and one wing of the house. During these repairs, workers discovered a sealed space between the walls of what had been Nathaniel Price's study and an adjacent sitting room. The space, which was approximately 3 feet wide and ran the length of the wall, contained several items of interest: a man's traveling case, a set of woman's jewelry later identified as having belonged to Josephine Price, and most significantly, a packet of letters bound with twine. The discovery was reported to the current owner of the property, a merchant named Henry Wilson, who had purchased Willowbrook as an investment rather than a residence. Wilson turned the items over to the county sheriff, who by this time was Samuel Parker, Thomas Reynolds having retired several years earlier. The letters, which were in remarkably good condition despite their years hidden within the wall, provided the first real insights into the events of 1842. The packet contained correspondence between Nathaniel Price and several individuals, some identified only by initials. The earliest letters dated from 1839 and seemed to pertain to business arrangements of an unspecified nature. The tone became increasingly urgent in letters from early 1842, with repeated references to our arrangement being in jeopardy and the need for absolute discretion. One letter dated April 25, 1842, and signed only T, presumably James Thornton, read in part, "The Charleston man has been asking questions in all the wrong places. If he connects us to the shipments of 40 and 41, all will be lost. Your silence has served us well thus far, but I fear it may no longer be sufficient." Another letter, this one dated May 5th and unsigned, was more explicit. Blackwood sails for Mobile on the 3rd. He claims to have documents proving the violations. If he reaches the authorities, we will all hang. You must intercept him upon arrival and secure whatever evidence he carries. Use whatever means necessary. The most revealing document, however, was not a letter, but a journal entry written in what experts later confirmed was Nathaniel Price's hand. Dated May 16th, 1842, the day before the family's departure for Bay Haven, it read, "I can no longer maintain this facade. The weight of silence has become unbearable. Blackwood's blood is on my hands, though I did not strike the blow myself. T assures me it was necessary, that one life is a small price to pay to protect our enterprise, but I can see in Josephine's eyes that she suspects something terrible has occurred. The children, too, sense that all is not well. They have grown so quiet, watching me with those accusatory eyes that remind me too much of Eleanor in her final days. We leave for Bay Haven tomorrow, but I harbor no illusions that we will find safety there. My sins have followed me from the beginning, and now they close in like wolves around a wounded deer. I have made arrangements for our passage south. If we can reach Cuba, perhaps we can begin anew. I tell myself this is for the protection of my family, but in truth, I think it is my soul I am trying to save. God help me, I have become a monster in my pursuit of fortune, and my silence has only served to nurture the darkness within. This journal entry, along with the letters, was examined by Sheriff Parker and subsequently forwarded to state authorities in Montgomery. The document suggested that Nathaniel Price and his associates, including James Thornton, had been involved in criminal activities, possibly smuggling or the illegal slave trade, and that Edward Blackwood had discovered evidence of these activities. The implication was clear. Blackwood had been murdered to prevent exposure of these crimes, and Price had fled with his family to escape justice. Armed with this new information, the authorities reopened the investigation into the disappearance of the Price family. James Thornton, who was still living in Mobile and had prospered in the decade since his partner's disappearance, was arrested on June 10, 1852, on suspicion of involvement in the murder of Edward Blackwood. According to court records, Thornton initially denied any knowledge of the crime, but when confronted with the letters found in the wall at Willowbrook, agreed to provide information in exchange for leniency. Thornton's statement, which was taken on June 12th and sealed by order of the presiding judge until 1960, provided the missing pieces of the puzzle. According to Thornton, he and Price had indeed been involved in the illegal importation of slaves, despite the prohibition that had been in place since 1808. Their operation had been elaborate and well concealed, involving falsified shipping documents and multiple transfers of human cargo to disguise the origin of the enslaved individuals who were ultimately sold to plantations throughout the Deep South. Edward Blackwood, Thornton revealed, had been an agent of a group of Charleston businessmen who had invested in the enterprise but had become concerned about increased scrutiny from federal authorities. Blackwood had been sent to Mobile not to expose the operation to the law, but to gather evidence that could be used by the Charleston group to pressure Price and Thornton into sharing a larger portion of the profits. The situation had escalated when Blackwood threatened to take his evidence to the authorities if his employer's demands were not met. According to Thornton's statement, the decision to eliminate Blackwood had been his, not Price's. He had hired 2 men to abduct Blackwood from his lodgings at the Harbor Inn on the night of May 15th. The plan had been to force Blackwood to reveal where he had hidden his evidence, then to dispose of him in a way that would suggest an accident or robbery gone wrong. Something had gone awry, however, and Blackwood had been killed before revealing the location of the documents. His body had been weighted down and dumped in Mobile Bay, but the weights had apparently come loose, allowing the body to surface and be discovered by the fishermen. When Nathaniel Price learned of Blackwood's murder, Thornton claimed he had been horrified. Price had been willing to engage in illegal trade, but had never contemplated violence. The discovery that his business partner had arranged a murder, combined with the fear that Blackwood's disappearance would lead authorities to their operation, had driven Price to flee with his family. Thornton swore that he had no knowledge of their current whereabouts and expressed genuine surprise at the discovery of the hidden cellar at Bay Haven and the items concealed in the wall at Willowbrook. James Thornton was ultimately convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison, though he served only 8 before being released due to declining health in 1860, just as the Civil War was beginning. The authorities continued to search for Nathaniel Price and his family, but no trace of them was ever officially found. The case was finally closed in 1870, when Price would have been 73 years old and was presumed deceased. The story might have ended there, relegated to local legend and occasional academic interest, if not for a remarkable discovery made in 1956. During the construction of a housing development near what had once been the town of Daphne, workers excavating for a foundation uncovered human remains. The skeletal remains of 5 individuals were found: a man, a woman, 2 children, and a male adolescent or young adult. The remains were examined by Dr. Harold Thompson of the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, who estimated that they had been buried for approximately 100 years. What made the discovery particularly intriguing was the condition of the remains. All 5 individuals appeared to have died from gunshot wounds to the head, executed in a similar manner. They had been buried together in a shallow grave that had been carefully situated beneath what had once been a small outbuilding, the foundation of which was still partially visible. The location was less than 5 miles from where Bay Haven had stood, though the summer home itself had long since been destroyed. Among the remains, investigators found several items that suggested the identities of the deceased: a signet ring bearing the letter P, a locket containing a miniature portrait of a woman who resembled descriptions of Josephine Price, and 3 small silver coins of Spanish origin that matched the type known to have been carried by Nathaniel Price as personal tokens. While DNA testing was not available at the time, the circumstantial evidence strongly suggested that the remains were those of the Price family and possibly their coachman, James Foster. The discovery prompted a re-examination of the case by historians and law enforcement alike. The prevailing theory that emerged was that Nathaniel Price had indeed planned to flee with his family to Cuba, but had either changed his mind or been prevented from doing so. The hidden cellar at Bay Haven suggested that he had initially tried to hide his family while making arrangements for their escape. Something had gone wrong, however, and they had all been killed, whether by Nathaniel himself in a moment of desperation or by others, perhaps sent by James Thornton or his associates, remains unknown. This theory was given additional support by a deathbed confession reported by Reverend Thomas Wilson of the First Baptist Church of Mobile in 1962. According to Reverend Wilson, he had been called to the bedside of an elderly man named George Davis, who claimed to have worked as an enforcer for James Thornton in the 1840s. Davis, who was nearly 90 years old and dying of pneumonia, told Wilson that he and another man had been sent to take care of Price and make sure he stayed silent after Thornton learned that Price was planning to flee the country. Davis claimed that they had tracked the family to a small cabin near Daphne, where Price had been hiding while waiting for a ship to Cuba. On Thornton's orders, they had killed the entire family, including the coachman who had remained loyal to Price. Davis's confession, which was never officially recorded as he died before formal statement could be taken, cannot be independently verified. It does, however, align with the physical evidence discovered in 1956 and provides a plausible explanation for the disappearance of the Price family. If Davis's account is accurate, then the ultimate irony of the case is that Nathaniel Price's silence, his refusal to reveal the full extent of his criminal activities or to implicate his partners even as he fled from the consequences, did not protect his family, but instead led to their destruction. The story of Nathaniel Price and the terrible events of 1842 has continued to fascinate historians and the public alike. In 1968, the last remaining structure associated with the case, the Baldwin County Courthouse, where records of the investigation had been stored, was damaged in a fire. While most of the documents had already been transferred to state archives, Some were lost, ensuring that certain details of the case will forever remain shrouded in mystery. What emerges from the fragments that survive is a portrait of a man caught in a web of his own making, whose silence in the face of mounting danger ultimately failed to protect the very people he sought to shield. Whether Nathaniel Price was a willing participant in the murder of Edward Blackwood, or, as Thornton claimed, an unwitting accomplice horrified by the violence his associate had unleashed, his refusal to speak out, to authorities, to his wife, perhaps even to himself, created the conditions for tragedy. The site where Willowbrook once stood is now part of a nature preserve north of Mobile. The foundation stones are still visible in places, half buried beneath decades of leaf litter and encroaching vegetation. Locals say that on certain nights, when the wind blows from the south and the moon is obscured by clouds, the air around the old foundation seems heavier somehow, as if weighted down by unspoken words and secrets too terrible to share. It is, perhaps, a fitting memorial to a man whose silence became not a shield but a prison, and ultimately a grave. In 1967, a historian named Margaret Russell published what remains the most comprehensive academic treatment of the Price case. In her conclusion, she wrote words that seem particularly apt. The tragedy of Nathaniel Price lies not in his crimes, grievous though they were, but in his belief that silence could protect him from their consequences. In his refusal to confront the moral implications of his actions, in his determination to preserve his family's innocence by hiding the truth from them, he created a vacuum that was ultimately filled by violence. His silence, meant to be a shield, became instead the instrument of destruction for everything he sought to protect. The remains discovered in 1956 were eventually interred in an unmarked grave in the Mobile City Cemetery, their exact location recorded only in documents that were sealed until 2011 in accordance with Alabama laws regarding unidentified historical remains. A small marker placed by the Baldwin County Historical Society in 1969 bears only the inscription, "Here lie the victims of silence. May they at last find peace in the truth that eluded them in life." And so the story of Nathaniel Price ends as it began, in silence, in shadows, in the spaces between what is known and what remains forever hidden. The whisper of the wind through the pines that once surrounded Willowbrook might be the only epitaph he and his family will ever truly have. A sound that, like the silence Price cultivated so carefully, signifies everything and nothing at all. Fim de narrativa. And so the story of Nathaniel Price ends as it began, in silence, in shadows, in the spaces between what is known and what remains forever hidden. The whisper of the wind through the pines that once surrounded Willowbrook might be the only epitaph he and his family will ever truly have. A sound that, like the silence Price cultivated so carefully, signifies everything and nothing at all. Yet, for those who have studied this case through the fragmentary records that remain, there are still echoes to be heard, still ripples spreading outward from that terrible spring of 1842. In 1962, a collection of letters was discovered during the demolition of an old boarding house in New Orleans. The building, which had once been a respectable establishment catering to merchants and travelers, had fallen into disrepair over the decades. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what had been Room 17, workers found a small tin box containing personal correspondence, a tarnished pocket watch, and several documents written in code. The items were turned over to the Louisiana State Museum, where they remained in storage, uncatalogued, and largely forgotten until 1965, when historian Robert Calloway happened upon them while researching an unrelated topic. Calloway recognized the potential significance of the find when he noted that one of the letters was signed N. Price and dated June 3, 1842. a week after the Price family had disappeared from Bay Haven. The letter, addressed simply to Jay and never sent, read in part, "We have reached safety, though I fear it is only temporary. The children ask daily when we might return home, and I have no answer to give them. Josephine has not spoken to me since the night I revealed the truth to her. I see in her eyes what I saw in Eleanor's before she died, that terrible knowledge that she has bound herself to a man whose soul is stained beyond redemption. I write this in the hope that you might yet extract us from this situation of my making, though I know I have no right to ask it of you. If you cannot, then know that I understand, and I release you from any obligation you might feel toward me or mine. The burden of this silence has become too great to bear alone. The identity of Jay remains a matter of speculation. Some researchers have suggested it might have been Judge William Harding, given the letter found among his effects. Others have proposed that it could have been a family member or another associate not previously identified in the historical record. Regardless of the intended recipient, the letter suggests that Nathaniel Price and his family had indeed escaped from Bay Haven and reached New Orleans, presumably en route to Cuba, as indicated in his journal. The other documents found in the tin box have proven more difficult to interpret. Written in a complex cipher, they appear to be records of transactions of some kind, with dates ranging from 1837 to 1841. Efforts to decrypt them fully have been only partially successful, but those portions that have been decoded align with James Thornton's confession regarding the illegal slave trade. What makes these documents particularly significant is a notation at the bottom of one page, in Nathaniel Price's handwriting, but not encoded. "This is the evidence of my damnation. May God forgive what men cannot." The pocket watch found with the documents bears the inscription, "To N.P. May time bring wisdom, J.C." The initials J.C. correspond to Josephine Crawford, suggesting that the watch was a gift from his wife. Its presence among the documents indicates that Price himself had stayed in the New Orleans boarding house, though whether his family was with him remains uncertain. These discoveries raised new questions about the fate of the Price family. If they had reached New Orleans by early June of 1842, how could their remains have been found near Daphne, Alabama? The answer may lie in the deathbed confession of George Davis, who claimed that he and another enforcer had tracked the family to a cabin near Daphne. It is possible that the Prices had returned to the area around Mobile Bay after their initial escape, perhaps because their plans to reach Cuba had fallen through, or because Nathaniel had decided to attempt a reconciliation with his former partners. Another possibility, suggested by forensic anthropologist Dr. Elizabeth Holden in a paper published in 1972, is that the remains found in 1956 were not those of the Price family at all. Dr. Holden, who re-examined the available records of the discovery, the actual remains having been reburied, noted several inconsistencies. The estimated ages of the remains did not precisely match what would be expected for the Price family, particularly the male adolescent or young adult, as none of the Price children would have been older than 6 in 1842. Additionally, the signet ring bearing the letter P was a common style in the antebellum South and not definitively linked to Nathaniel Price. It is entirely possible, Dr. Sato. The proximity to the former Price property and the presence of items similar to those associated with the Price family may have led investigators to draw connections that are not, in fact, supported by the physical evidence. This theory gained additional support in 1975 when a graduate student named Thomas Jenkins, researching Cuban immigration records for a dissertation, discovered an entry dated September 12, 1842, recording the arrival of a family named Parker, a man, a woman, and 3 children from New Orleans. Holden wrote, that we are looking at two separate events: the disappearance of the Price family, who may indeed have escaped to Cuba or elsewhere, and a separate, unrelated murder of another family whose identity has been lost to history. What made this entry noteworthy was a marginal notation indicating that they had previously resided in Mobile, US. While the name discrepancy is significant, it was not uncommon for individuals fleeing legal troubles to adopt aliases. Further supporting the possibility that the Price family reached Cuba is an entry in the ledger of a plantation near Matanzas, dated 1845, recording a payment to N. Parker for services as bookkeeper and translator. The entry was discovered by Cuban historian Maria Rodriguez in 1983 during research on foreign nationals in colonial Cuba. Rodriguez noted in her paper that many Americans who settled in Cuba during this period adopted new identities and professions, particularly those who might have had reasons to conceal their previous lives. The historical record becomes increasingly fragmented after this point. There are no further confirmed references to Nathaniel Price or a man who might have been using an alias in Cuba or elsewhere. The trail of the family, if they did indeed escape to Cuba, grows cold. The most likely explanation is that they lived out their lives in obscurity, perhaps moving again to another location where their past would be even less likely to follow them. What remains most compelling about the case, however, is not the question of where the Price family might have ultimately settled, but the psychological and moral dimensions of their story. Nathaniel Price, as revealed in his own writings and the accounts of those who knew him, was a man consumed by the consequences of his own moral compromises. His involvement in the illegal slave trade, a practice that, even in the antebellum South, where slavery was institutionalized, was recognized as particularly odious, had led him down a path of increasing isolation and secrecy. The silence, referenced in contemporary accounts, was more than just a reluctance to speak of his illegal activities. It was, as psychohistorian Dr. Jonathan Friedman suggested in a 1988 analysis, a metaphor for Price's entire approach to moral conflict. Rather than confront the ethical implications of his actions, Friedman wrote, Price chose to compartmentalize them, to wall them off behind a facade of respectability and domestic tranquility. His household's notorious silence was the external manifestation of his internal refusal to engage with the moral consequences of his choices. This interpretation is supported by the recollections of Sarah Johnson and other household staff, who consistently described Willowbrook as a place of unnatural quiet, where even the children learned early to suppress their natural exuberance. "The master, he couldn't abide noise," Johnson stated in her 1863 testimony. Not just loudness, but any kind of disruption to the quiet. It was like he needed that silence to keep his thoughts from getting too loud. The psychological toll of this enforced silence is evident in what we know of the family dynamics. Josephine Price's letters to her mother, preserved in the Crawford family papers, reveal a woman increasingly isolated within her own home. "There are days," she wrote in October of 1841, "when I feel I might scream simply to prove to myself that I still have a voice." Nathaniel retreats more and more into his study, emerging only to issue instructions or to stare at the children with an expression I cannot decipher. Is it guilt, fear, some emotion for which there is no name? Whatever demons pursue him, he refuses to give them voice, and in doing so condemns us all to this half-life of whispers and unasked questions. The Price children, too, seem to have been affected by the atmosphere of repression. Thomas, the eldest, was described by his tutor, William Barnes, as uncommonly reserved for a child of his years, observing much but speaking little. In a letter to his own family, dated January 1842, Barnes wrote, "The boy watches his father with such intensity, as if trying to decipher some complex text written in a language he has not yet mastered. When asked a direct question, he often pauses for so long before answering that one begins to wonder if he has heard at all. It is as if he must carefully consider each word before allowing it past his lips, a habit surely learned from observing his father. This intergenerational transmission of trauma, for that is what modern psychologists would likely call it, highlights one of the most poignant aspects of the Price case. Nathaniel's attempt to protect his family by shielding them from knowledge of his activities ultimately created a household defined by unspoken tensions and emotional distance. The very silence he imposed as a form of protection became a prison for all of them, isolating each family member in their own private experience of an increasingly untenable situation. When the crisis came in the form of Edward Blackwood's investigation and subsequent murder, the foundations of this carefully maintained silence crumbled. Whether Nathaniel Price himself orchestrated Blackwood's murder, as some evidence suggests, or whether it was indeed the work of James Thornton acting without his partner's explicit consent, as Thornton later claimed, the result was the same. The tenuous moral equilibrium that Price had maintained through silence and compartmentalization was irrevocably shattered. The journal entry dated May 16, 1842, reveals a man finally forced to confront the full weight of his choices. I can no longer maintain this facade. I have become a monster in my pursuit of fortune, and my silence has only served to nurture the darkness within. This moment of self-recognition came too late to prevent the cascade of consequences that followed. The flight from Willowbrook, the desperate hiding at Bay Haven, and whatever fate ultimately befell the family. In this light, the story of Nathaniel Price becomes not just a historical mystery, but a parable about the destructive power of moral silence. Price's refusal to acknowledge or speak about the true nature of his business, even, perhaps especially to himself, created the conditions for disaster. Each compromise, each line crossed without acknowledgement, made the next easier, until he found himself complicit in murder and fleeing with his family into an uncertain exile. The archaeological evidence from Willowbrook, limited though it is, supports this interpretation. Excavations conducted in 1982, before the property was incorporated into the nature preserve, revealed that Price had made several modifications to the house over the years, each seemingly designed to create more private spaces. The study, in particular, had been repeatedly reconfigured, with walls thickened and doors reinforced, creating what the archaeological report described as a fortress within a fortress. The hidden compartment beneath the floorboards and the concealed space between walls, where the letters were later found, suggest a man increasingly preoccupied with secrecy and concealment. Perhaps the most telling artifact recovered from the site was a small silver key discovered in what had been the master bedroom. The key did not fit any lock found on the property, and its purpose remained a mystery until 1987, when curator Richard Townsend of the Mobile Historical Museum made a connection to an item in the museum's collection. A small silver locket, donated decades earlier by a family with no known connection to the Prices. The locket, which the key opened, contained a miniature portrait of a woman who bore a striking resemblance to the one description we have of Eleanor Price, Nathaniel's first wife. An inscription inside the locket read, "Remember that truth once spoken cannot be unheard." Whether this was a message from Eleanor to Nathaniel or something he had inscribed himself as a reminder or warning remains unknown. What is clear, however, is that the sentiment it expresses stands in stark contrast to the code of silence by which Nathaniel Price lived, and by which he may have died. In the final analysis, what makes the Price case so compelling is not just the historical mystery or the unanswered questions about the family's ultimate fate. It is the way in which their story serves as a microcosm of larger themes in American history and human psychology. The illegal slave trade in which Price was implicated represented one of the darkest chapters in the nation's past, a chapter that many at the time, and since, have preferred to keep shrouded in silence. Price's personal moral compromise mirrors a national one, his enforced household silence a reflection of a broader social unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths. On an individual level, Price's story speaks to the psychological toll of living with unacknowledged guilt and the limits of compartmentalization as a strategy for managing moral conflict. His attempt to create a clear division between his business activities and his family life, to be one person in the counting house and another at Willowbrook, ultimately proved unsustainable. The walls he built, both literal and metaphorical, could not contain the consequences of his actions indefinitely. The legacy of Nathaniel Price's silence continues to resonate in unexpected ways. In 1991, during the construction of a new courthouse in Mobile, workers uncovered a small metal box that had been sealed into the cornerstone of the previous building, constructed in 1872. Inside was a collection of documents relating to local history, including a handwritten account by Sheriff Thomas Reynolds, who had led the initial investigation into the Price family's disappearance. Reynolds, writing 30 years after the events, offered a perspective that had not been included in his official reports. Of all the cases that came before me in my years as sheriff, none has troubled my sleep more than that of Nathaniel Price and his family. Not because of any failure of justice, for I believe that Price, whether by his own hand or another's, paid the price for his crimes, but because of what it revealed about the nature of silence. In all my inquiries, I was struck by how many had suspected that something was amiss with Price's business dealings, how many had observed his strange behavior or heard rumors of irregularities, yet none had spoken. It was as if a conspiracy of silence had protected him until it was too late, until blood had been spilled and lives destroyed. I've often wondered since how many evils persist in this world, not because of the strength of those who commit them, but because of the silence of those who suspect but do not speak. Reynolds's reflection brings us full circle to the central paradox of the Price case. Silence, intended as a shield against the consequences of wrongdoing, ultimately amplifies those consequences. Had Nathaniel Price confessed his involvement in the illegal slave trade before Blackwood's investigation, had he, in essence, broken his own silence, the outcome might have been legal consequences for him personally, but perhaps not the destruction of his entire family. Instead, his commitment to silence escalated a business matter into a capital crime, turning him from a smuggler into an accessory to murder. Today, the physical traces of Nathaniel Price and his family have largely disappeared from the landscape. Willowbrook exists only as a few scattered foundation stones in a nature preserve. Bay Haven was reclaimed by the waters of Mobile Bay during a hurricane in 1926. The grave marker placed by the Baldwin County Historical Society has weathered to near illegibility. Even the records of the case exist primarily as fragments scattered across archives and collections, many lost to fire, flood, or simple neglect. Yet the story endures, passed down through generations of local historians, retold and re-examined by each new scholar who stumbles upon some previously overlooked document or connection. It endures because, at its heart, it is not just a historical curiosity, but a human story. A tragedy in the classical sense, in which a man's defining characteristic, his insistence on silence, becomes the instrument of his downfall. In the silence of the pine forest that now covers the site of Willowbrook, in the whisper of waves against the shoreline near where Bay Haven once stood, we might imagine we hear an echo of Nathaniel Price's final realization that some truths cannot be silenced forever, that some burdens cannot be borne alone, and that the wall of silence we build to protect ourselves may become, in the end, our tomb.